Hello and welcome to a very special presentation from Liminal Corporation. Today, on this Sunday, we do a small weekly review of what has happened and we answer a question that has been direly necessary for all employees for the last week. That is, how do you determine if you ended up in a space of liminality, that is, in a space that may or may not potentially be dangerous despite the clear absence of a threat? Today, in this presentation, which is somewhat freeform, for it serves also a template purpose for a future, more concentrated content, shall we say, we're going to explore what liminal spaces are, what your relationship to them might be as a free-roaming user or a free-roaming employee, and how you can get out of one, potentially. Although, frankly, it's more important to recognize if you're in one or not, because by the time you're in one, the methods of getting out are usually very, very circumstantial and, frankly, unresearched. So if you do ever find yourself in a liminal space and you have successfully identified it thanks to this here handy guide and presentation, do not hesitate. Do not hesitate even for a moment, for a millisecond, for a speck of time to write back to us with some kind of proof or video material, photo material, any kind of material, as soon as you're out, to help us update and expand on our common knowledge. Today's presentation will be led by yours truly, Ibero model DEEN. Sorry. That's D, 2 E's and an N, right there. What that stands for? Well, of course, that's the Definitive Experience Enhancer Navigator. That's right. Tonight, you are accosted by the most groovy, most booming possible presenter of such topic. And sadly, we haven't done too much of an extensive research yet again, because, you know, the live experience has been somewhat patchy, but we will do our best to compensate while on stream, through a kind of a stream of consciousness, you know? Get it? Because it's a stream, and there's a stream. Those two things can't be named similarly for no reason at all, right? So, there must be a connection. Now, whether you're watching this in recorded form, or whether you are being live, feel free to ask questions. You may even be answered. But, worry not. All the answers will have at least a 50% rating of usefulness. Now then, let us move on to the presentation hall. Is this thing on? Hello, hello. Oh, what is this bar there in the screen? Hold up. That ain't... Oh, that's a bit scuffy. Let's correct that. Let's resize the slides real quick. There we go. Much better. Way better. So, hopefully you can hear all the way back in there. And you're comfortable in your seats. You're all well and prepared. Because we're about to guide you into the wondrous land of liminal spaces. Now, throughout this week we have played, or rather we have run our intern through 3 simulations of such a liminal experience. You know, the Anemoneopolis, that's one. The Flesh, Blood, and Concrete, that's two. And the third one was One Shot. Oh yes, of course, and of course there was also Cat World, which makes it four. Sorry, but you know, Cat World was so short of a system demo, it may as well count as a half, or maybe as an addition. Point is, we have done an extensive run through of various spaces that may or may not be considered liminal. But you may be wondering, what is a liminal space and what isn't a liminal space? And worry not, these questions will be answered rather shortly. But first, quick outline. What we are aiming to do three things in this here little public lecture. Number one is to answer the question, what are liminal spaces? You hear the term thrown around all the time, over and over again, and yet no one can coherently express what exactly it means, because in recent times, with the popularity of backrooms and such, the term liminal space has gone to mean pretty much any creepy place. Then we will go on how to identify whether or not you are currently in a liminal space. We will go through the basic signs and steps that may help you identify whether your situation is indeed as dire as it may seem, or whether you can relax. And finally, examples of liminal space in media that you can use to train yourself to recognize a liminal space without actually having to encounter one. As always, media provide us with a fantastic opportunity to experience something from entirely the safety of the confines of our apartments and offices and any other places that have access to a video playing device of sorts. So yes, using those types of media, you can effectively prepare yourself for any kind of situation. Sorry, weird gesture there. Right. Please have in mind that a time for Q&A will be at the end of presentation, which may or may not also turn into a time for a stream of consciousness. Of course, that all depends on you, dear viewers. Now then, a bit of a boring piece of text, but we'll bear through it. Liminality, in its essence, it comes from the Latin word limen, which means a threshold or a border between two places. So inherently, by definition, a liminal space is sort of a space where you experience a transition, where you are, not because that is your destination, but because you have to traverse through that space to get from point A to point B, as it were. Therefore, these places aren't necessarily made to be inhabited, but they are meant to be populated, if that makes sense. Those aren't places where you would expect to find people just sort of existing 24/7. People only find themselves in those places because they have to. They have to use those spaces for a traveling purpose. But lately, as said before, there has been a rather sudden trend where the term liminal spaces and anything associated with them has evolved to describe creepy places in general, rather urban feeling, an urban mystery feeling. You see, now any kind of place that seems abandoned, be it a hospital, be it a subway car, be it a playground with no children on it, it may be called liminal purely for the uncanny factor. But, and this is an important question, is it truly liminal? How can we determine? How can we determine whether a space is indeed truly liminal, or if it's just a misnomer brought on by the sudden popularity of backrooms culture and weird core aesthetic, web core, all that sort of thing? And there are easy ways, of course, because we have here the definition of liminal space, which we will use in our quest to define those things. So we will mainly look at the fact whether a space is meant to be habitated or not, and whether it is usually supposed to be populated by people or not. But more on that in the next slide. Examples of liminal spaces which you may often find online are spaces like these. You see, vast corridors, columns supporting the ceiling. These, or alternatively, actually, they can also be rather narrow. The point is, there's always a feeling of emptiness. That's the key point. That's what one could say defines the liminal space. The fact that it's rather strangely and eerily empty. Oh, right, also, perhaps an accompanying soundtrack would help out. To help you understand the feeling. There we go, something like this. So, with this in the back, try to take it in. Walking through a place like this. Tiled floors with patterns. Materials clearly used for their cheapness, not necessarily for their aesthetic purposes. Places made not for humans to look at them, because who really looks at a corridor, you know? Who really particularly holds their gaze on such a place? Easy to build ceilings, fluorescent lamps meant to simulate daylight in conditions where windows simply aren't available usually, because once again, in a transitory space, you don't need a window. You don't need to look out the window when you're not really meant to stay in the place in the first place. That's very important. That does bring a piece of attention to functions of windows in general in spaces. So this one's better. Yeah. Right? Yeah, that space will be cut out. Sorry about that. Yes. So, windows, right? Windows in a normal living space are meant to provide access to sunlight, right? To remind the people in the dwelling that there's a world outside, that they're not locked in, because otherwise it creates a rather claustrophobic feeling. And also, mind you, a lack of windows in a space inevitably leads to humans inside of it losing track of time, which is not something you would want normally, unless, of course, it's a casino. Which is why most casinos, don't have windows. Let's tone it down a bit. Whoop. Yeah, there we go. So, imagine a place like this, right? Imagine a place with a tiled floor, cheap materials, not built for human consumption, as they say. That's the key point. It's a space not necessarily meant for a human being to be in for a prolonged period of time. It is purely functional. Purely functional. Sometimes it is purely form, even. It's... yes, perhaps calling it purely functional is not quite right. It's more of the fact that this space is only meant to be there to let you pass through it. But we repeat ourselves, of course. So, these are examples of what's commonly known as liminal spaces. Now, what do those things have in common beyond the materials they're made of and the lack of windows, or the presence of... Sometimes windows are present. That's not necessarily a defining trait. But there are certain characteristics, and while these are not all sufficient... while these are not necessary... Yeah, that's the other way around. There are necessary characteristics, of course, and there are sufficient characteristics. That's the scientific method. You don't need to have all the sufficient characteristics to determine something, whether something is A or B, but you do need the necessary characteristics. These are more of a sufficiency criteria. So, if those are not true, that doesn't mean you are not in liminal space, but if these are true, for example, you are rather likely to be in one. So, how do we know if you are in a liminal space? Number one, it is most likely a public space. And that doesn't mean any stationary space either. It doesn't have to be just a library or a school or a hospital. It doesn't have to be, say, what other things we can think of? It doesn't have to be a government building. It doesn't have to be an office. Offices also do kind of count because they are, for all intents and purposes, public space. It doesn't have to be... Sorry. It doesn't just have to be a pool. It doesn't just have to be those things, yes. But it can also be a bus. It can be an underground train cart. It can be, actually, in some cases, a regular train cart. It is a space that is, once again, not intended for people to dwell in. Only to come in, do their business, and leave. And transport is a very interesting subsection of that, which we really could get in, but, you know, we might leave that for perhaps a later date, for the liminality of transport and the dangers of transport, and for the scary factor of the public transport, because public transport does deserve its own chapter, not just for the sake of how convenient and transformative it is for a civil engineering perspective, but also for how many things do happen on public transport that you would normally never ever see otherwise. So, the second point is, of course, usually that public space is filled with people, because once again, it is intended for people to come in and do their thing. Now, it doesn't mean that they have to do their thing in the place for a short period of time. They can do it for hours. They can do it for the whole working day, but they have to leave at some point. They're not there to stay. So, in a hospital, people come in to get treated, and they leave. And they can't stay for several days, but the point is, they are supposed to leave. They're not meant to stay in a hospital. Public pools, same. Gyms, same. Offices, same. Transport, same. You get the picture. Of course, it's better of a clarifier that it's used by a large number of people, not just by, say, a family. So something like, say, a car is not necessarily a liminal space. It is rather intimate. Or perhaps an apartment. Exactly. An apartment will hardly ever be called a liminal space. In fact, it will probably never be able to find examples of apartments as liminal spaces. Why? Because it is not that uncanny for an apartment to be uninhabited, to be empty. And once again, an apartment is not meant as something transient. On the contrary, it's something where people come in. It's somewhere where people live for a long-term duration. What else is there to add, really? Oh yes, and of course, there's a vital distinction to be made that liminal spaces are vastly different from something like the allure of the abandoned structures. You know, sometimes people see photographs of destroyed hospitals, apartment buildings intended for demolition, places that are half destroyed due to war or some kind of technogenic catastrophe, and they think that this also counts as liminal space, but they are very wrong. For a destroyed building is not creepy or weird because, you know, it's destroyed. Because there's no one... Sorry, it's not weird or creepy for a destroyed building to be empty. That's the main point. There's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with a destroyed structure being empty. It's in fact quite natural, because now that the advantages of that dwelling are destroyed, no one should be there. So the danger of an abandoned hospital, danger of an abandoned camp or a house is rather another question: who destroyed it or what? Because whatever caused that destruction may still well be within reach and may still be dangerous. And if it made such damage to the structure, who knows what damage it can do to you, an unlucky visitor of such a place. So, based on what we already know, let's go through a somewhat of a test, somewhat of a refresher that will illustrate how our criteria help us determine the liminality of a place. In front of you, you see three pictures. One is an empty school hallway. The second one is a destroyed school hallway. And the third one is a perfectly normal apartment. A picture taken from a real estate agent's office. Now, here's the question. Which one of these is liminal and which one isn't? Based on what we previously know, an empty school hallway, for example, it's clearly a space not meant to be inhabited. It's clearly a space meant to be used by a large amount of people. Sorry, that... whoop, didn't mean for that to appear. A space meant to be used by a large amount of people. And also, let's not forget, it is in very good condition. So, and that's the adding part. That's the thing that adds to the experience. The fact that even though there's no one to be seen, there clearly seems to have been maintenance done on the place. And that's unnerving. That's uncanny, because if there's no one in there, who keeps the place up, right? And it's that uncertainty that makes a place... that makes the liminality of it creepy. So, that kind of checks out, right? Now, the abandoned school hallway. Here, in this case, it's clearly abandoned due to decay. Or rather, it's the other way around. It's decayed due to abandonment. So something must have happened a while ago, you know. The ceiling is certainly decrepit. The glass is broken. The lockers are no longer functional. Therefore, we can establish that whatever activity that has been going on has ceased for a while now. Makes sense. So it's not necessarily that scary. It is uncanny. It is weird to see a place that's been used. That's the problem with abandoned spaces and the confusion with liminal spaces. Because they also have the feeling that it's a place made for a large amount of people. It is a place made to be used. It is, in fact, actually, let's go check back. It is a public space. Yeah, it used to be filled with people. But the fact that it's not in good condition doesn't make it liminal. Sorry, makes it not liminal. Makes it the other one. So, a destroyed building is not liminal. Finally, an apartment. Look at this peculiar example. Now, here we have a dwelling that is normally inhabited. You can see there are things. There's clearly people that live here, albeit not with the best of tastes, as you can see by the pillar with the writing "Always be happy," and by random photographs of assorted sky sites on the walls, but it is still a very much inhabited place. And it's clearly kept up. Although, the important factor here is, it is not a public space. And it is not transitory in any way. It is not a space which you only pass and never return to. It is a place that you end up in. Hello there, Ice Cake. Thank you for visiting us. We're doing a little public announcement, a little lecture, you know. Liminal spaces and you. How to determine whether you find yourself in a liminal space, which something you might need, you know, out there in the wild. We are using information we have gathered over this week to try and determine what makes a space liminal, and trying to identify some handy little traits. Now, if you missed, here's a quick refresher. There are 3 sufficient but not necessary traits to liminal space. It is public, it is usually filled with people or used by a large amount of people, and it is in good condition. And therefore we conclude an empty school hallway does have that liminality feeling. It does have that creepy feeling, because it is a place where people are no longer there, despite it's usually being filled with people, despite it being built for large amounts of people. The second one is a destroyed school hallway, which is not liminal, simply for the fact that even though it's public space, even though it's uncanny that it is a space that is now abandoned, even though it's been used by a large amount of people, there is no danger in it. It doesn't seem dangerous. Whatever caused the damage is either away or it's more obvious. It doesn't have that weird sensation to the brain that makes you confused as to what exactly the danger may be. And the third part, you know, a question that no one seems to have asked. Can apartment buildings, can flats be liminal? Can they create that feeling? And to that we answer no. Because an apartment is not a public space. Even if an apartment is kept in good condition, even if it is a space that can house a family, still, it ain't liminal. It is not meant to be something transient, because that's the definition of liminality. It's a boundary, a transition between one place and another. It's a space that you visit when you have to go from A to B. So, how can you use media to educate yourself on liminal spaces so that later in the wild you are able to identify one and preserve yourself? You know, because usually liminal spaces, they do have that trait that something in them, whatever made everyone disappear, may not necessarily be the best thing for your well-being. Be it a night guard or an eldritch monster from the boundaries of outer space. And here comes the interesting part. You may remember that in a lot of horror movies, the characters end up trapped in a space that's usually normal, like say a mall or a hotel, a hospital, and then that space becomes dangerous because it's inhabited by some kind of evil entity. And that's what brings the, shall we say, the thing to the horror movie. Because the key to most horror movies, if not to all, is that horror movies take a normal everyday concept and they transform it through adding danger, through adding tension. So, a popular trope, for example, in zombie movies, right, is that characters find themselves in a mall. It's pretty much a cliche by this point, but characters find themselves trapped in the mall. Usually there are either zombies in the mall or there are zombies outside the mall, and there is a weird, eerie feeling when they realize that the commonly used shops, the spaces where people used to hang out, the fountain, the pool, all that stuff, it's no longer right. It's abandoned, it's kind of empty, even though in some zombie apocalypse stories the mall is freshly abandoned, so it feels like everything should be fine, but it's not fine. And that creates tension even before the zombies attack, or even if zombies never attack. Alternatively, in another film we'll talk about in a couple of moments, The Shining, the action takes place in a technically abandoned hotel. Well, the main character and his family, they're meant to be the caretakers of the Overlook Hotel, sorry. And the hotel itself is rather uncanny because even though they take care of it, it's completely empty, and everything in it that is meant to be used by people is just sitting there. So the father of the family, Jack, that was probably his name, even though he's played by Jack Nicholson, maybe that's the confusion there. He uses the large lobby room to write his book, and that creates this uncanny feeling because that's not really how that space is meant to be used. It's too big for him, and yet it's empty, it's clean, it's pristine, it's just not quite right. And this is another thing we need to consider. Consider the distinction of a place being empty because there's some kind of evil force at work that, you know, removed the normal presence of people, that removed the normal public, and a place emptied because the normal public just fled. So, when a place is empty due to a reasonable cause, such as, say, a terrorist attack, or a foreign army invading, or aliens, something like this. Or perhaps there's a serial killer on the loose and everyone escaped, or maybe there's a mass shooting going on, you know. So in those cases, the danger is clear and present, and the emptiness of the space itself is very well founded. It is an interesting concept, it is an interesting contrast when you think about it, on why spaces are emptied. And there are plenty of examples. So the concept of liminality, you know, it may have been a bit more formed in the later couple of years due to the popularity of backrooms and creepypastas, but let's not forget, there have been movies that emphasized the creepiness of hospitals and hotels and such, and schools, let's not forget schools, for ages now. The classic Stephen King stories often take place in schools, or in other public spaces. But of course, the Shining example, pun intended, is in The Shining. And although it's not necessarily about the concept of a liminal space as it is. It's more about the evil force that transforms the loving father into a serial killer. The hotel also feels in itself like a malicious entity. And it feels like that throughout the movie, specifically because there is no one in there. It's a hotel through which a young child can just run around. Normally, that's not allowed. Normally, a young child would be very heavily barred from doing stuff like that. And yet, here he is, riding his little tricycle all over the place. Unsupervised. And that's when the hotel is transformed into a mysterious and dangerous place. Similarly, in Silent Hill. Silent Hill is a plethora of liminal spaces. Of course, there, the danger is a bit more present in forms of monsters, and the fog, and the nightmare world. But you could pretty much make a list of liminal spaces by taking the Silent Hill games and listing their locations. Love me some Silent Hill, exactly! Silent Hill had a feeling like no other, which was sadly ruined in the last couple of instances, but we can actually see why. We can actually see why that happened. So let's remember what was Silent Hill 1 like, right? You had the town, you had the major locations were school, hospital, sewers, although that was a bit later, the motel, if you went that route. What else was there? The mall, and then there was also the nowhere. Those were the big locations, you know. And of course the town itself, which is empty and abandoned, and even though people should be there, they are not. So it checks out. Silent Hill in general is a liminal space populated by monsters, however. So that fact kind of distracts you from just kind of thinking, or rather ruminating, on why does it feel so weird. Silent Hill 2, same thing really. You have woodside apartments, you have the hotel, you have the hospital, yet again, unsurprisingly. You have, what else was there? The amusement park, or the Lakeview Park, whatever it was called, the bar, and the buildings next to it. So if you take out the monsters, these buildings always have that weird feeling to them that they were only recently abandoned. They're not decrepit, they're just empty. Everyone's gone away somewhere. And then of course you know why, because you know the magic and the monsters and all that. But before you encounter the monster, it's not the anticipation of the monster that keeps you on your toes. It's exactly that feeling of a space unruly abandoned. Silent Hill 3, same thing. You have the mall, you have the amusement park. There was a sewer level in there, probably. We don't remember much of Silent Hill 3, but it had a bunch of places like this too. And Silent Hill 4, despite not being the most well received, it still kind of manages to fit that in, because it still has those empty spaces like the subway and the forest. Although frankly, forest would probably not be a liminal space, because in a forest you don't expect anyone. You don't expect to see anybody. So perhaps Silent Hill 4 is where the downside kind of truly began. From a pure liminal space horror to a monster-based horror. And that's exactly where Silent Hill 5 Homecoming fell through. Because Silent Hill 5 took the idea of the movie, you know, weird things happen, everything goes bloody, bloody rain goes down from the sky, everyone turns into weird coat-joined Jacob's Ladder monsters, and it just took that and turned the game into Soldier Finds Monsters, you know, a Resident Evil kind of thing, except actually worse. Even though the themes were there, the general feeling was lost, because it was now clearly a monster hunting game. It was clearly, the attention was focused on the fact that you may encounter a very scary, tooth-filled entity that would very much like to munch on your extremities. And then Silent Hill 6 Downpour, even though not a bad game in itself and its own right, also had a similar problem, because despite the town being empty, it had other people in it. That kind of ruined it, frankly. The monsters were also monstrous. They clearly had an agenda of killing everyone on sight. So once again, the feeling was lost to a general idea of, you gotta fight the demons, John. You gotta fight the demons. And then John discovers, no, I am the demons. And then John was a zombie. So, that is what we learn. That is how the downfall of the Silent Hill series really progressed. And that's why it happened. So now you understand. Now you may understand better. It's not just that the quality went down. And you can actually see in Shattered Memories how it almost reversed. It almost reversed back to how it should have been, because in Shattered Memories, you also spend the larger part of the game in this weird tension, in this anticipation, as the frozen town didn't quite explain where everyone went. Of course, the frozen, the cold and the winter and the ice everywhere, it wasn't quite liminal anymore, because once again, the uncanniness wasn't there, since the town was clearly transformed by ice and no longer inhabitable. But yes, that's pretty much it. That's a small little retrospective on why Silent Hill changed so much and what exactly they got wrong. They went too hard on the occult angle instead of exploring the liminality of it. But can we really blame them? They were the trailblazers, Team Silent, in Konami. They didn't know. They didn't yet know what they discovered. They discovered liminal spaces before liminal spaces were even a thing. So perhaps they may find their feet yet again, or we may get another experience like that. And another thing in media which played really well on liminality, and there are some way better YouTube videos on this topic. Source games such as Portal, Half-Life 2, Portal 2 in fact, Team Fortress 2, Counter-Strike even. All Source-made maps have this weird feeling to them as well, because they are usually quite open. The textures are almost realistic, and they all have this feeling of spaces where people should have been, but aren't anymore. It is the cleanness of the texture specifically. Let us put a small disclaimer. Things in Half-Life 2 and Portal aren't always clean. The walls have scratches on them and scabs and all that stuff, but it still doesn't feel abandoned. It just feels kind of lived in. Laboratories in Portal always feel like someone should be there, like someone should be watching you, like there should be other test subjects running through those corridors, because they were clearly built for human beings. And let's not forget, these spaces are usually public, usually fight in public spaces, in Half-Life 2, in Counter-Strike and stuff like that. Although we can't really summarize in a short sentence what is it with the Source engine game specifically that gives them that feeling, but it has been many times noted that if you ever load any Half-Life Deathmatch maps or Counter-Strike maps in solo mode, it will feel very creepy and very weird. Hell, even the standard Garry's Mod map, you know, the one with the building and the underground stuff and the lake, it feels weird, it feels strange, it feels uninviting in a way that isn't obvious. So, if you ever find your hands on one of those products, don't hesitate to use them. Don't hesitate to use them to experience liminality and enhance your understanding of it. And now, this is the more free-flowing part of the video, where we shall consider what else can be added to this topic before perhaps we make a more comprehensive set of slides and notes about this. If you have any questions, now is a good time to ask them. We will make note and we will do our best to answer. Maybe we can actually bring up some examples for your entertainment and or enjoyment. So then, what else is there to add? Liminal spaces. Usually populated, suddenly empty. Condition Where's the dang thing? There it is. Definition. Clean. Lived in. But not derelict. What else can be said? What else can be said? Danger. Not immediately obvious. Perhaps non-existent. Examples of movie. No, actually, examples of spaces. Let's go with that. Examples of spaces that may be liminal. Schools. Hospitals. Hotels. Pools. Apartment complexes. What else we got? What else do we name? Hotels, this. Amusement parks. Examples of spaces that aren't liminal. Apartments, oddly enough. So, that's the weird thing, isn't it? An apartment complex... Actually, maybe no. Maybe we should take the apartment complex off the list, because it is only weird in Silent Hill 2 that you can walk into apartments. Not that they are... Like, it's weird the whole place is empty, you know? So it only makes it weird when the entire building is emptied out. Perhaps a better fit would be something like an office. And it is sometimes exciting, you know, to stay in the office after hours. And if you work in a small office that doesn't have security, where everyone has their own key, you may have a unique opportunity of actually spending the night in an office. That is not recommended because people will ask questions, but if you ever feel like not going home after work, or just, you know, you have that deadline that you need to crack on, you may just find yourself staying in an office space overnight. Not recommended, once again, but rather tranquil at times. Hospitals, no, schools. Schools is perhaps the most experienced liminal space among people, because lots of children stay for extracurricular activities, or say they have after-school duties, such as cleaning or sorting through papers, helping out with something, locking up the gym equipment, and they may find themselves in that weird hour of, say, around 6 p.m. or so, 7 p.m. Especially in spring or autumn when the sun is already setting and the school halls and school classrooms are painted in this weird rose, almost crimson color by the sun, turning everything unfamiliar, turning everything scarily unfamiliar, especially with the chairs being put up on the tables. School turns into some kind of hellish landscape, even more so than usual. There are quite many spaces that can be liminal. Public transport is one of them. In fact, if we did a better job and sat down and properly mapped it all out, we'll probably discover that, indeed, pretty much the larger part of all the spaces around us are transient. That they are liminal. They are not somewhere we should be dwelling. Because, indeed, humans dwell in a very small amount of places, comparatively speaking. When you think about it, how much space in a city is taken up by residential areas, and how much of it is entertainment districts, how much of it is industrial districts or business districts. And you will probably notice that the residential areas often comprise a rather small part. comparatively speaking. Of course, we don't mention the apartments that are situated in business districts. Those are kind of their own beast. But purely residential areas take a minority, because the city is a structure that works, so to speak. You know, it has many functions to it. Although we may be sorely wrong, by the way, and perhaps once again, better research is necessary, which will be done for a second iteration of this seminar. This whole thing is more of a test drive, a draft of the script for a potentially more in-depth look. But yeah, examples of spaces that aren't liminal include apartments, houses. Where else can a group of people exist for a long period of time? Islands? That's for another reason though, because islands aren't public spaces. Neither are forests. They're all... Nothing that isn't urban, basically, can be a liminal space. Because outside in the countryside, it is nature that takes up most of the space. You could say that liminal spaces are a kind of a counterpart to wild nature in an urban setting. They are a sort of... They are an equivalent of rows of trees and dark forests, but for the city dwellers. Perhaps also crime-risky places can't really be liminal, so, you know, back alleys, because you don't expect people to be there in the first place. Places, maintenance places? Such as maintenance tunnels in the subway, staff-only rooms, background spaces in the cinema, you know, things where technicians are supposed to be. So those places usually aren't very populated, and if you do end up in a space like this, in a back room, as they say, but not in the back room in the way we know now, it's not really that creepy for it to be empty and abandoned. So, that's what we have learned so far. What else can we think about? Oh yeah, let's think of more examples in media, actually. Movies with liminal spaces in them. Now, we've already said about... No, we already talked about The Shining. Perhaps Dawn of the Dead would be appropriate? But no, that movie is mainly focused on the dynamic between survivors. Alternatively, 28 Days Later does have a good example of that, because in the beginning, when the protagonist is roaming the city, the emptiness is very uncanny. Fun fact, they filmed those scenes during actual mornings in actual London. So it has that feeling of nothing being destroyed. It doesn't have the feeling of apocalypse. It just feels like people just up and left, which gives them exactly the kind of liminal feeling we're looking for in a liminal space experience. What kind of movie will be set in an abandoned school? Or rather, in an empty school? Some kind of Students from Hell experience? Probably not. Empty hospitals? None of that either. There was a movie... Wait, let's think about that one. There was a movie about a night guard, though. We vaguely remember there was a movie about some guy doing night guard duty in a hospital. Although, that is a very faint memory. Can't really think of anything. It may have been The Autopsy of Jane Doe. You know what? We're not going to lie, but we will investigate this matter further. Actually, there haven't been that many liminal space movies about hospitals, when you think about it. Or any horror movies set exclusively in a hospital. That probably would be boring. You could perhaps call the Reanimator a horror movie set in a hospital, but it's set in other places too. Although the hospital is indeed the prime scene of action. Now, let's see, what else is there? This list is cut rather short. Schools, eh. Hospitals, eh. Empty malls, you know what? Fine, let's add... Oh, right! Let's not forget, of course, there is the I Am Legend that had that part. Although, we're gonna take that off the list immediately, because it has clear signs of destruction. It's also quite funny, because if you compare... If you think about Portal and Portal 2, Portal 2 adds the uncanniness by adding the destroyed parts of Aperture Science. But they have a different feeling to them in comparison to the uncannily empty test chambers of the first game. Is the mist about liminal spaces? Not really, because everyone there is just huddled in a supermarket, and it's not very empty at all. Something like... Ghost ship? Oh, actually, yeah. Ships? Yeah, that could work. Something like triangle or ghost ship. Let's put ghost ship in brackets. Oh, whoops, sorry, 1 second. Алло. Алло, привет. Whoopsie daisy. Well, that's getting cut out. Ah, worry not. Sorry, this was a business call. All of a sudden, in the middle of a stream. How embarrassing. We should probably set the phone to do not be disturbed for those periods of time. And we shall. We shall in the future. But our assumption, frankly, with the stream is that no one was gonna show up anyway. So we took the bold... we took the bold step of not being very prepared. But we apologize. We do apologize if the experience have been somewhat ruined by this. Now then. Triangle, ghost ship. Yeah, so cruise ships or otherwise ships make for interesting liminal spaces. And these two movies about them, They are interesting examples of that. Ghost ship in a lesser degree, because the ship is intact only in the hallucinations of the crew, you see. So it doesn't really count as intact, but Triangle feels rather liminal, because the movie also takes place in a ship, and it's completely fine. So there we have it. We have paranormal activity, zombies, and other weird stuff. So, ships is a new and unexpected potential theme for liminal space. And perhaps we'll stop here for now. Can't really think of anything else. Games with liminal spaces. Of course, Silent Hill. Cry of Fear is the shining example of a Source game with exactly the kind of liminal space we're talking about. And what else is there to add? What else is there to add? Portal, well, let's just say Source games in general. Alan Wake wouldn't fit. Takes place in the woods. In the boonies, as they say. Fatal Frame could be, but things are mostly destroyed in there due to ghosts. Or rather, ghosts are there because everything's been destroyed. Animopolis is a shining example, of course, another one. A recently indie game we played. Yumeniki wouldn't count because those are dream spaces. Come on, neurons. Activate! What else is there? Weird places that have been abandoned. The Last of Us? Nah, it doesn't quite work. It's also an apocalypse. Public servers of World of Warcraft? Oh, that's actually an interesting thing. Could that be a medieval liminal space? So, like a castle. But not a castle in a sense that it's, you know, a tourist attraction or a sort of architectural legacy. But perhaps it is liminal because it's recently been abandoned by its inhabitants exactly in that era. So, that's an interesting question to consider. Can there be creepy World of Warcraft liminal spaces? Or other medieval settings of liminal spaces? Bioshock would count if it wasn't so decrepit. But maybe we can give Bioshock a pass. There's those super old mansions in Europe that nobody owns because they have no modern tech. Huh, okay. No modern tech. So you would say... But if nobody owns them, no one lives in them either. And frankly, no, mansions wouldn't quite work. Mansions wouldn't quite work because remember, they're not spaces that meant to be... They're meant to be lived in, right? It's not weird for a space that people live in to be empty, because that just means they're temporarily absent. But it is weird for a place through which people pass all the time to be empty, because that's its only function. You see? But no, those are interesting. That's an interesting idea. So those mansions in Europe, are they built this way, or are they just refurbished? Is that how it is? Would you know? Actually, you know what? If mansions often used as conference rooms, maybe we need to consider. You don't remember? Oh, that's fine. But it is an interesting thought. Thank you for bringing that to our attention. I just know you can get a medieval mansion for like 1 million. Oh yeah. There's been loads of like programs on TV, you know, where they talk about how owners of these mansions are, how about it? They are in deep financial trouble, specifically because even though their ancestors were rich and allowed them to have those mansions, they themselves can't sustain that kind of lifestyle. So they have a massive problem on their hands. Perhaps now's the time to acquire mansions. Who knows? Maybe that's how we solve the housing crisis. By buying up mansions and housing our friends in them. But do keep in mind that, yeah, giving maintenance to a mansion is a nightmare and a half. Not to mention they don't have any modern systems of ventilation or heating or anything like that. But yes, as you may have figured from a oh yeah, VTuber house. Yes, exactly. Buy up a mansion, make up a European VTuber house from those. Just like the Final Fantasy house and Sky William house. Ooh, we heard bad things about Fantasy House, the Final Fantasy house. Something bad happened there, didn't it? But it is interesting how that concept kind of just popped out of the ground, where entertainers buy up places to live together in and collaborate and all that stuff. It's such an... It makes sense, but it's never been done before. Well, it's never been done until influencers became a thing. You can't really... Although perhaps, no, that's not quite right, because earlier artists and musicians and stuff like that, they also would have communal living spaces where they would, you know, all pitch together and buy a large house for themselves, probably. Or they would just be living, you know, apartment blocks known for housing creative people in them, in New York and such, for example. But yeah, on that note, we're going to have to cut the stream a little bit short. We didn't know how long this was going to go, but thanks everyone for coming. Hopefully you've learned something new today. This was more of a draft, but we are being called on a rather urgent little meeting right now. So this Just Chatting stream will unfortunately be rather short. This was more of a trial, more of a test, more of a attempt to see how it all works out. And it has indeed worked out great. Also, whoops, sorry, the microphone should be in front of us, but we don't need it anymore. Our voice is booming and loud as it is. Now then, this ends our presentation on liminal spaces and you. Now you know the basic, essential signs of being in a liminal space, and hopefully you will use them to stay safe in the future. This was Iberodine, and we now jump right back to the front desk. Hello again! Yes, this was a short and sweet little stream, testing out the whole Just Chatting thing. If you came along, and you liked, and you haven't followed yet, please do. And if you want to see more, please tell us. We know this hasn't been the most spectacular presentation. We'll work on it in the future, but frankly, you know, maybe we were a bit too ambitious with 4 streams a week, and we will not do one next week, but we will see how everything else goes, and things will work out. Chatting is fun, yes! Thank you for listening to us, if you have. Thank you for listening to us ramble. We have discovered quite a few interesting things, actually, at this point in time, which we will definitely ruminate on, and perhaps make them in a more organized form at a later date. Now then, Labor Corporation would like to wish you all the best. A schedule will be published soon, and if we feel crazy enough, the next stream may also happen in a rather short time. Say in 10 hours? That could be possible. So stick around, find out, look at the Twitter, because you will be informed very, very soon. The next thing we're going to be looking this upcoming week are methods to keep yourself hydrated in this heat. So that will be the theme. We will be talking about methods of hydration and the training programs that will be centered around how one can efficiently get hydrated. So if that's something you would be interested to, keep an eye out. But now is the time to say goodbye and perhaps maybe even rate someone? Is there anyone who is in dire need of companionship on this Sunday evening? What is even happening? Who could we come and help out? Let's see. What is happening today in the world? Ah, Sylvia Queen is playing Subnautica. AIM Vtuber is doing Crime Side. All very exciting things. What is Crime Side? Crime Side sounds interesting. Let's go check what AIM Vtuber is all about. He is a fiery guy, always fired up about something. Pun very much intended. Now, where's the raid? Where's the raid? Where's the raid? There we go. Crime Side is cool. Oh, alright. Let's see. Let's see what it's about then. Surprise inspection is, as always, the message. So, thanks to everyone who came to this little Just Chatting stream. Thanks to everyone who's been with us throughout the week. We're looking forward to meeting you again in the next 7 days. And as always, Liver Corporation wishes you all the best, wishes you a great evening, and as per usual, bye-bye!